Today is Saturday, July 1st. It's official now. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled affirmative action in college admissions is unconstitutional. It was a 6-3 vote late this week, banning colleges and universities from considering race as a factor in the admissions process. We spoke more about the details of the ruling in yesterday's news roundup. But today, we want to go back and review what these cases were about and the wide-reaching impact of this decision. So we're replaying the conversations we had just back in April. At the time, most people expected this outcome already. And as you'll hear from the director of admissions at the University of Connecticut, many have already been preparing. But first, I chat with Supreme Court reporter Amy Howe. She's a contributor for SCOTUS blog and also covers cases on her own blog called Howe on the Court. In our conversation, you'll hear more about the history of affirmative action and what questions still remain for the future. Welcome to the Newsworthy Special Edition Saturday, when we sit down with a different expert or celebrity every Saturday to talk about something in the news. Don't forget to tune in every Monday through Friday for our regular episodes, where we provide all the day's news in 10 minutes. I'm Erica Mandy. It's now time for today's Special Edition Saturday. Amy, thank you so much for joining us here on the Newsworthy.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So the Supreme Court is looking at two cases that challenge affirmative action. But before we get into those, can you first briefly explain the history of the most recent Supreme Court decisions on affirmative action?
The key one that's really at issue right now is a case called Grutter versus Bollinger that dates back to 2003. And the court ruled in that case that the University of Michigan Law School could consider race in its admissions process as part of its efforts to assemble a diverse student body. That was a 5-4 decision by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. But she did say at the end of that opinion, she said, in 25 years, we would expect that the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interest approved today.
So now looking at these two current cases that have reached the Supreme Court, first give us just the basics on who is suing, so we're all on the same page, and then let's talk about both sides of this argument, starting with, the groups that are suing. What is their argument, their accusation?
So the group that is suing is a group called Students for Fair Admissions. One of the cases involves Harvard College. The other case involves the University of North Carolina, my alma mater. And in both cases, the group is asking the justices to hold that the Constitution and federal civil rights laws bar any consideration of race in college admissions. They're asking the justices to overturn their decision from 2003 in Grutter. They say at Harvard, Asian American applicants are less likely to be admitted than similarly qualified white, black, or Hispanic applicants. And at the University of North Carolina, which is a public school, they say that Carolina is violating the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, which bars racial discrimination by government entities. They say that UNC is considering race in its admissions process when it doesn't need to do so to achieve a diverse student body. And what Students for Fair Admissions is saying, in essence, is that the Constitution is colorblind, that in 1954, in Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court rejected the idea that race should play any role in school admissions. The university's argument is that race is just one factor that admissions officers consider, but that being able to consider race is important to being able to achieve a diverse student body.
Is the group suing saying that diverse campuses are important, but there's other ways to go about it? Or are they just saying at the end of the day, this should not be a factor, it should be based on merit?
I think it's sort of a combination of both, perhaps. They're saying that race should not be a factor, that the Constitution is colorblind, that if the universities want to have a diverse student body, that there are other ways to achieve it. And they point to some of the states, like California, in which the universities no longer consider race as part of their admissions process. And they say there are other ways, for example, by providing a lot of student aid so that you are drawing in lower income students, by having outreach to lower income students, to first generation college students. The universities say, we've tried those methods and they don't reach the levels of diversity that we want.
And I understand you were there when the justices heard the initial arguments. What was your biggest takeaway, and how would you describe the justices' responses so far?
The conservative justices were really skeptical of the court's past precedents allowing the consideration of race and of the university's admissions policy. Justice Clarence Thomas, had questions along the lines of, what exactly does it mean to have a diverse student body, and what exactly are the academic benefits of having a diverse student body? Justice Samuel Alito asked, how does a university know when a student body is sufficiently diverse that it no longer has to consider a student's race? Justice Amy Coney Barrett, one of the newer justices on the court, said, what happens if we get to the 25-year mark that Justice O'Connor described in the Granger decision, and it's still hard to have a diverse student body? I will say that in both of these cases, the lower courts rejected the challengers' arguments. They upheld Harvard's consideration of race in its undergraduate admissions policy. They upheld the University of North Carolina's consideration of race.
What are the main possible conclusions or decisions?
So, the main possibility, and I think the one that is probably the most likely outcome, is the justices could overrule the Granger decision or say, the time for Granger has come to an end, and in some way hold that universities can no longer consider race in their admissions process. There are other sort of less dramatic steps. They could send these cases back for another look. Then, of course, they could say, we're saying again what we said in Granger, universities can consider race as part of their admissions process. We won't know until they issue the opinion.
So it's kind of essentially either keep allowing it, narrow it, limit it, affirmative action, or ban it altogether.
More or less, yes.
Is there any one point that you think is often misunderstood or that you just want to highlight for the average person when it comes to these cases?
One thing that will be interesting to watch is what the Supreme Court does, if anything, with regard to the military and the military academies. Back when the Supreme Court heard oral argument in Granger in 2003, there was a brief that was very persuasive. The Supreme Court seemed persuaded, really interested in a brief by a group of retired military officers, and they said, the armed forces in America really reflect the broad range of people in America. We've got a very diverse armed forces. We need a diverse officer corps to command this diverse armed forces, and to have a diversity in our military academies need to be able to consider race in their admissions process. And this was something that came up again at the oral arguments last fall in the Harvard and North Carolina cases. And the Chief Justice said, well, do we have to decide that in this case because the military is different from universities? So, that's something that I'm going to be watching to see whether that makes a difference. And then I'll also be interested to see, what happens to things like preference for legacies, the children of alumni and the children of staff and then athletes. How does that factor into admissions as well?
One final thought or takeaway about what stood out to you or just about these affirmative action cases?
It's a very high-profile case, and it's something that I think a lot of people are watching closely. The impact of the court's decision could be quite broad. One of the points that was made in the briefing, 40% of all universities and 60% of all selected universities consider race in some form. It's an issue that the American public is divided on. There was a Reuters poll in February that 62% of Americans said that race and ethnicity should not be considered at all in admissions. So if this is another case in which the court overturns its past precedent, I'll be watching to see what the reaction to this decision is by the American public.
And a quick update to one of the questions that Amy Howe highlighted. Will this ruling apply to military academies such as West Point and the Air Force Academy? Well, turns out the justices did not address that issue with this week's decision, but they did note, however, that military academies are distinct or different. So some are seeing that as exempting those institutions. Ultimately, there might be a separate case to come before the Supreme Court in the future to address military academies specifically. But either way, how will other higher education institutions handle the affirmative action ban? Will they still prioritize diversity? And if so, how? We heard from the director of admissions at the University of Connecticut and the chair of the National Association for College Admission Counseling, Vern Granger. That's coming up. But first, a quick break for our sponsors. Have you tried AG1 yet? I had been intrigued for a while, but once I finally tried it, I realized what all the fuss was about. And now I literally drink it every day. I drink AG1 in the morning, usually as I'm getting my toddler breakfast, and it makes me feel ready to take on the day and like I'm doing something good for myself and my body. It's been a really easy habit to implement since I can actually feel the benefits. I've noticed I feel more sustained energy throughout the day, and I appreciate knowing it's supporting my immune system too. I love that AG1 replaces the need for a lot of other supplements like a daily multivitamin, minerals, pre- and probiotics for gut health, adaptogens, and a greens blend. And you get all of that in just one scoop of powder mixed with water. I personally like the extra hydration I get with it too, so that's much better than taking a bunch of pills. If you're looking for a simpler, effective investment for your health, try AG1 and get 5 free AG1 travel packs and a free 1-year supply of vitamin D with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/newsworthy. That's drinkag1.com/newsworthy. Check it out. Also today, I want to tell you about another podcast to add to your playlist that's both entertaining and informative. My friend's podcast, The Jordan Harbinger Show, was named Best of Apple in 2018 for a reason. Jordan dives into the minds of fascinating people, from well-known names like Neil deGrasse Tyson, Mark Cuban, and a past interview with Kobe Bryant, to the likes of mobsters, hackers, and hostage negotiators, offering unique wisdom in every episode. You'll learn something new with each conversation, and sometimes it's connected to a news topic we're talking about here, like the episode where he talked to a former U.S. ambassador to Russia who says he's still being trailed by the Russian government. Jordan has a talent for getting his guests to share personal stories and thought-provoking insights. And it's not just these in-depth interviews either. In his weekly segment, Feedback Friday, he responds to listener questions about everything from asking for a raise at work to helping a family member escape a cult. Search for The Jordan Harbinger Show. That's HARB as in boy, IN as in Nancy, GER. The Jordan Harbinger Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Okay, now to my conversation from April with Vern Granger, the director of admissions at the University of Connecticut. Vern, thank you so much for coming on the Newsworthy.
Thank you, Erica, for an invite.
So first, I just want to make sure everyone understands how affirmative action actually works right now. So how can or does race currently factor into admissions decisions?
It's a part of our what we call a holistic evaluation of an applicant. And that means that we take many different factors into consideration when we are considering a student's application for admission, with race being one of them. And so I think that there is the misunderstanding that applications are routed based on race. So white applicants go through one pathway and students of color go through another, or that applications are bucketed. Those type of things, which are just not the case. No applicant is going to be admitted to a university exclusively by their race. Another misperception is that there are quotas, and so a university is enrolling X percent of this race ethnicity or X percent of that race or ethnicity. And again, that's not the case either.
I want to talk about the potential impact of the Supreme Court decision. But first, what do you expect from the Supreme Court? Because a lot of reports are saying they expect either a ban on race-conscious admissions or significantly rolling them back, limiting what universities and colleges are allowed to do. So what do you expect?
I think many of us are considering the possibility that there could be some changes to the policy and how we are able to consider race in the application review, if at all. So this case could have an impact on all areas of admission, both undergrad, graduate, and professional schools. It could have an impact on scholarships. It could have an impact on enrichment programs at institutions. So it could be very wide ranging.
Yeah, let's highlight a couple, like one or two of the top impacts that you foresee if these policies are banned or limited.
Yeah, so, admissions, we've talked about merit scholarships, how applicants are reviewed for merit scholarships. A lot of universities will go through a process similar to their admissions where they will do a holistic review of an applicant for merit consideration, and race is one of those factors, the many factors that's a part of that. It could even extend to, pre-college programs. So I think that there's this perception out there that, this case is going to impact a narrow number of institutions, your very highly selective institutions like a Harvard or a UNC. But this is going to be, again, far-ranging and impacting really all post-secondary institutions.
What's your take on the argument that perhaps schools can look at things like socioeconomic status instead of race?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that universities will be looking at. To some extent, the universities are already considering that. But I think it bears saying that after Proposition 209 in California that prohibited the use of race in those state institutions, or in Michigan after the ballot initiative that was passed in that state, and other states as well that have similar bans on race and ethnicities, those institutions experienced a very sharp decline on the composition, the enrollment of students of color at their institutions. And so that's the big fear that we have. Also, what happened in these cases was that they saw a decline in the numbers of students of color who were actually applying for admission to the institution. So there were students who were actually self-selecting out of the application process altogether.
Any steps that you think universities could or should be taking to ensure diverse campuses, no matter what the Supreme Court decides?
One of the things that institutions are doing right now is being proactive in affirming their commitment to diversity. So you're seeing institutions come out with statements, talking about, whatever the decision is. Number one, we're going to follow the law like we have been doing for the past 40 years of case law precedent that has affirmed the value of diversity. But whatever the decision is, we're going to follow the law. But we are not going to shy away from our commitment to the value and the importance of diversity on our college campuses. And so I think that is the top thing that you're seeing and you will see from institutions, whatever the outcome of the case is. But again, we are preparing for the potential of a negative decision, and we're all having conversations about what we can do to mitigate any negative impact to the diversity that we value on all of our campuses.
So just a final thought about why diversity is so important.
The research is very, very clear that diversity on college campuses not only impacts students of color, but it impacts all students. Things like critical thinking. The research shows that students who are in more diverse environments have higher critical thinking, higher problem-solving abilities, that they are more likely to be engaged in their communities, that it better prepares all students to be able to be competitive in the global workforce, and it fosters mutual respect and teamwork. And so the evidence is very, very clear that diversity benefits all students, and that's why institutions really have it as a strategic pillar of our institutions, because of the importance that it holds in helping to prepare this generation of students to really compete in this very complex and ever-changing society that they will be entering.
Well, thank you again to both Amy Howe and Vern Granger for sharing their insights with us. And of course, we'll be covering reactions and impacts from this week's historic decision in our daily news roundups, along with much more news you need to know each weekday. We'll be back on Monday with the latest news in 10 minutes. Until then, have a great weekend.